Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Well, there's always a ton of different changes going on with Mythic Plus in particular for Dragonflight Season 2. It always seems to get a bit more frustrating every single time. In this video, I want to talk about what some of those key frustrations are for Dragonflight Season 2, personally, why I'm not having fun, and of course, I'd love to hear what you guys are thinking about this season, as well as some of the points that we're going to be making. For me, I think the top 3 points for why Dragonflight Season 2 is probably the worst that I've experienced in a few years. Starts with the class balance, also goes into the inconsistent difficulty of the dungeons, where you're kind of swinging back and forth between certain parts of the dungeon being really hard, really annoying, certain dungeons getting nerfed, certain dungeons getting buffed, and of course the overall dungeon buffs and nerfs that we've seen as well from class tuning. And then finally, I think that the expectation of who you are playing with when it comes to judging a player by their IO or their background is harder than ever before, which adds a ton of frustration in being able to successfully build pug groups and just establish connections. Of course, class balance is probably like the biggest duh. What we saw in Season 1 of Dragonflight was that, well, when class balance is good, everybody's able to kind of play and put together different useful compositions. Yeah, you still want to have things like the Druid's versatility buff with Mark of the Wild, but you could have variety. You could have a Resto Druid, you could have a Boomkin, you could have a Bear if you wanted to, right? There was an option in terms of which of those specs could be brought to the higher level dungeons. And yeah, there was a meta, of course, we saw that with MDI. But you're able to see really deep variety across the board for 20s and up of who could be able to do these high keys. I believe the title cutoff was doing like around 25s and 26s in Season 1. And so being able to bring a lot of different specs into that 0.1% top range was really encouraging for people just doing their 20s, that you can kind of invite everybody. And that, I think, is probably the biggest point about Dragonflight, is it's almost like a fragile expansion. You're not having a lot of different ways to be able to advance your character at endgame outside of, Mythic Plus and rating. And I'd even argue that Mythic Plus is even more important than ever before, because the way that they're bringing out the portals from the very beginning, and you want to be able to unlock new portals every single season, the way that there are the additional rewards for doing higher level dungeons, the way that it actually is very competitive with rating in terms of the gear that you can get, minus of course some of the trinkets. It's all really for players to be playing a lot of dungeons in Dragonflight, but also pugging a lot, because when it's all about convenience in this expansion, respecting your time, you're not always having people who can be online at the exact same time that you want them to every single time. And as a result, you might be at the mercy of the pug scene, which isn't that big of a deal in Dragonflight Season 1, when you could bring whatever spec you liked, give or take. But in Season 2, when you have Exodia comp just dominating everything, it's insanely difficult for these off-meta specs and people who really identify with the spec or class that they've played for many years to get invited to groups, because they're not in that top 5 specs of the game like Exodia is. And so if you're not getting invited, well, there's a lot of other good games that are coming out right now, and you see people just playing something else. For those who have still been playing the game, wonderful. But you're also very likely playing the flavor of the month with the Exodia comp, or you're playing with a very large amount of pieces of Exodia. You're playing with an AUG all the time. You might be playing with a Holy Paladin, you might be playing with a Bear, you might be playing with a Fire Mage, you might be playing with a Shadow Priest, right? There's a lot of these specs that are just very powerful, and you can kind of make it work. I did it with my Disc Priest in a recent video where I was playing with Bear, Disc Priest, Fire Mage, and Warlock, with an augmentation of Ochres, that I was able to make it work in those higher level dungeons, and it works, but you're still running 60% of the comp off of Exodia. And so as a result, whenever the Exodia comp starts getting nerfed, yeah, it hurts this best overall composition with all the great synergies that are available on hand, but it also is going to affect people who are trying to make it work with some of the pieces of Exodia. And that also is going to make things increasingly difficult. When dungeons just scale in health and damage, and then you have a spec in the game that is increasing everybody's health and damage by significant margins, and then you start nerfing it, of course, it's just going to make dungeons naturally feel harder at the exact same level you ran them before. And then it goes into this very swingy situation. When augmentation was first released, all of these dungeons started getting railroaded, and people are pushing up 2 key levels or even higher from what they usually were doing. Now we're at a point where they reined it in, they brought it back down to earth. People started getting used to it. They started getting comfortable with having to work a little bit harder to advance their IO score. But a lot of people did see that increased difficulty. They saw that the easy mode was turned off and stopped playing. Now they started nerfing the dungeons. Of course, it's a 10% scale between 19 and 20, but now at 20s and above, it's increasing in health and damage by 8% instead of that previous 10%. So it's actually taking a key level or a key and a half level off of some of these higher level dungeons to allow players to further advance. But we just spent the last like 3 weeks having a harder time doing the dungeons, and now they're making them easier, sort of invalidating some of the effort that you're putting into those previous weeks. And for those who are wanting to push for title, or they wanted to push for a specific breakpoint or something like that, now there's like the fear of missing out almost. That, hey, you gotta go back in there, gotta keep up with the score. Oh, it's, you know, you're not capped on keys yet, you gotta go back in. That's just like a frustration for people, where they don't quite feel like they're at a level that they completed, and you went from, oh, I feel like this challenge is more than enough for me, and then now there's massive challenge has been reduced, and you're sort of swinging back and forth between that difficulty for dungeons that should scale and increase in difficulty over time. You also don't really have any sort of like borrowed power in the mix that is increasing your power level over time either. We had it with, corruption back in the day. We had it with, your Azerite neck, all these different systems. And I'm not saying they need to bring these back, mind you, but there were things that steadily decreased the difficulty of the dungeons by further increasing your power level. Another side of it is that there were ways to sort of spice up how each season felt. And instead of feeling a little more powerful every season, feeling like you're getting some additional bonuses. Yeah, we got our tier sets and we got them quick. Besides that, there wasn't any sort of new jazz to what we had going on. And by that, I think BFA, you saw that one season you would have essences that would allow you to utilize different talents or builds or just kind of play differently. Another season you had corruption, which was highly customizable once, of course, they fixed it with the vendor. You even had in Shadowlands where you were having the conduit trees being upgraded. You also had affixes that were actually beneficial, unlike Thundering, where you could have encrypted and then you could start going after cooldown reduction if you wanted cooldown reduction. You could go after speed and stealth. You had these very noticeable strengths to seasonal affixes that don't really exist anymore. And I get the reasons for why they don't exist, but it also takes away a bit of flavor and uniqueness from the seasons, and you start hitting a point where your character power gets maxed out quickly, and then these large swings in terms of the dungeon's difficulty between buffs and nerfs and class balancing abound. It is really disorienting for a lot of players, and for people who don't want to keep up with every single little breath that's happening with the game, they might just look elsewhere. One of the biggest ways to really reach friction with people, whether you're playing on a competitive team or a casual team or anywhere in between, is when your goals don't fit the team's or vice versa. And when it comes to Mythic Plus, IO is kind of the only indicator that you have of skill. Maybe if they raid, but a lot of people don't raid these days or don't raid Mythic these days. And so as a result, you see in LFG a lot of players in the group that are 9-9 heroic and then at varying levels of Blizzard IO score. With all of the crazy swings that we saw in Dragonflight Season 2, Augmentation Evoker gets released. The season cutoff rating for the 0.1% title jumps like 200 points in the course of a couple weeks, right? Then they nerf down Augmentation. The IO flatlines and it stays steady for a while, slowly increasing. Now they just nerfed Dungeons, and so the score is probably going to increase by another 100 points or so. You have these large swings going on that suddenly things are really easy, then they get stopped, and then they get easy again. And as a result, you have a lot of churn in terms of people's IO. You don't really know when they got it, if they got it at the easy weeks, or they got it in the harder weeks, or anywhere in between. And as a result, you don't really know where a lot of their skill stands. In the past, if you were in, say, Dragonflight Season 1, if you saw everybody that had a base level of 20 dungeons completed in time, you could have a pretty good understanding that, hey, they know the dungeon mechanics, they know what their job needs to be, they probably know most of the positioning in terms of how they need to orient themselves. They can do their job at a solid level. If they're doing 23s and 24s in time already, They're familiar with some of the advanced routes and pulls, maybe not all of them, but they have a decent understanding of them. And they have a pretty good understanding of like kick rotations or like how to use their crowd control. If you're getting into the 0.1% range, I think that was like 25s and 26s if I remember correctly. It's like 3,300 to 3,400 in Season 1. Well, they're going to be more familiar with the high key routes, the pulls, the interrupts, how to use defensives, how to survive, right? You had those different breakpoints that could tell you different things about the players and what to expect when you invited them. Now, all of that is just out of the window. You just don't know what you're going to be getting out of players when you invite them to your groups. And as a result, you just get these deep swings in performance from people. I've seen like augmentation evokers in some like pub groups of like 3,300, 3,400 rating. And like their uptime out of like Ebb and Might was super low. They were stuck in like the speed window or the speed attunement for like 80% of the dungeon or something crazy along those lines. There was a lot of moments where, yeah, if they just played the game a lot in the easy mode, they could get jumped up in IO very quickly and very rapidly. And then they start kind of coming back in after all these dungeon nerfs and Exodia nerfs. Content is way harder. And they can't get away with that sort of poor performance. It's also jarring for regular players who did gain a lot of IO and were used to not having to try too hard. And then they do feel forced to try that much harder for it. And then it gets demotivating for them and they may not play as well. I know I've had moments where I wasn't playing as well because I was like shocked by how much harder it was after a lot of the Exodia nerfs came in, after seeing some of the damage nerfs that were coming in, and being used to bosses dying, 20, 30 seconds faster, being used to trash pulls dying faster. And then as a result, you have to change a lot of your actions and your behavior as a healer to be able to adjust around those things. Because the fastest way to reduce your healing is to just kill things faster. But then when it takes a longer time, I'll fully admit for healers, it gets a lot more challenging and it has to be another relearning lesson for you as you get into higher level dungeons. It gets incredibly frustrating. And frankly, this is about the most frustrating season that I've experienced since maybe Beguiling in BFA Season 3, where it felt like the affixes in that situation were just constantly frustrating and constantly against us. But some of the more favorite seasons that I had were things like Awaken, where the affixes seemed to help and guide you going forward, where it felt like you had power increases moving along through the higher ranks. I also felt like a lot of Shadowlands Season 3, Season 4, where you actually were getting increased power or strength to be able to help you along the way, whether it was the form of seasonal affixes or borrowed power, added spice to the game and added interest to the game, even when the dungeons themselves didn't change too much. I'm curious as to what you guys think for Dragonflight Season 2, but for me, I really am looking forward to what Season 3 is, when Season 3 is going to be announced, and what they possibly could be doing to sort of spice up a bit more of Dragonflight. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it. Be sure to sub, and I'll catch y'all next time.